and that God would be right to wipe out humanity and destroy the earth. And yet again we saw hope, God rescuing a people for himself in Noah and his family. And then in Genesis 12, God made promises to Abram. He promised that he would make his descendants into a great nation, that he would give them a land, and that through Abram's descendants, all people of the earth would be blessed. Well, today, as we continue our aerial view of the whole of the story of the Bible, we'll see Abraham's descendants, Israel, enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, and then called out of Egypt, brought out by a powerful God. We'll see God establish a covenant with his people. And finally, we will see God bring his people into the land that he promised to them, his king established in Jerusalem. So if you were here last week, you might remember that this was the pattern established at creation. God's people in God's place under God's rule. And today, as we travel with Israel from Egypt to Mount Sinai, then to Jerusalem, we'll see God's partial kingdom established. God had promised to Abram, later called Abraham, I will make you into a great nation. This is in Genesis. And then in the next book of the Bible, in Exodus chapter 6, verse 7, we see God starting to act on that promise. As he doesn't leave Abraham's descendants crushed under the oppression of slavery in Egypt, but instead through Moses, God tells Israel, I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. And in Exodus 7 through to 11, if you remember your Sunday school stories, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had a hard heart, and he refused to listen to God or his prophet Moses. And so through Moses, God sends warning after warning after warning to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians in the form of signs and plagues, until finally in Exodus chapter 11, God sends a warning through Moses that every firstborn son in Egypt will die. As we heard in the reading, Moses and all Israel are given the command that each household is to take a lamb and kill it and put the blood of the lamb on the doorframe of the house. The lamb acts as a sacrifice so that God will pass over the house marked with the lamb's blood. The lamb dies so that each firstborn son of Israel will live. And as God calls out a people for himself, the Israelites go out into the desert, leaving their captors behind. They come to a mountain called Mount Sinai, and in chapter 19, God descends to the top of Mount Sinai, and he calls Moses to the top of the mountain. And God speaks to Moses in Exodus chapter 20, giving Moses the 10 Commandments. This is God establishing his covenant with Israel. Well, what do we mean by a covenant? You enter into a covenant or a contract when you buy a house, or when you buy or sell a car, or when you enrol your kids in a school. There's an agreement that your child will get an education and you'll abide by the rules of the school. Marriage is a covenant, an agreement, promises between two people for life. And of course, the central covenants in the Old Testament are first the covenant with Noah, and after the flood, God promises to Noah that he will never again destroy the world with a flood. Second, the covenant with Abraham. God promises to raise up a great nation from Abraham's descendant and to give them a land to live in and to bless them, and through them to bless the whole world. And third, as we're now hearing, there's the Mosaic covenant. God promises that Israel will be his chosen people, and then he rescues them out of Egypt. And as a response, Israel is to obey God's law. Now, I'm not going to read all of chapter 20. If you've been in a church for a while, you'll be fairly familiar with the 10 Commandments. But just let me read these first few verses. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, there's so much we could unpack in those verses, but remember, we're doing a quick aerial view here, so I just want to notice a couple of things. First, God identifies himself as the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. God, in his grace, initiates this covenant with his people by first rescuing them. God takes the first steps. He doesn't wait for his people to obey the law or to be good enough or acceptable. He graciously acts first. But notice also that he is a jealous God, a God who calls his people to love him first above all else. And there are consequences, both blessing for those who respond with obedience and punishment for those who don't. Now, there are two errors in our thinking that we need to avoid here. First, I want you to imagine a parent and a child. As the child grows up, the parent's watching carefully until finally the child turns 18 and the parent says, sorry, but I've decided you're not fit to be called our child. You just really haven't come up to scratch. All the rules we've set and the expectations we told you about, you just haven't quite come up to the standard. You haven't qualified. That would be monstrous, wouldn't it? You wouldn't dream of doing that. But sometimes we approach God as if he is that abusive parent. We assume that we must do enough or be enough to qualify to be his child. But friends, that is not how God operates. We see time and time again in the Bible that God acts graciously, first adopting his children, not because they deserve it, but because of his great mercy and kindness. And then God's children are called to respond in love and obedience. And that brings us to our second error to avoid. Sometimes we think of God as gracious and loving, but we lose sight of God's holiness, his righteousness, his perfection. And so we slip into thinking of God as being like a father with really no rules, no standards, no discipline. And we know in human terms how that ends, don't we? This is the parent who ends up being treated like trash, not with the proper respect, because there are no consequences for poor behaviour. And again, that is not the God of the Bible, either the Old Testament or the New Testament. God extends grace to the ungracious, love to the unlovely, and then he calls for a response of obedience. So where are we up to? We have God's people, Israel, under God's rule and blessing, and they will continue under his rule and blessing if they choose wisely and obey him. But what about the third part of God's promise, God's place? Joshua chapter 21, verses 43 to 45. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to their ancestors that he would give them. And having taken possession of it, they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. We have God's people, Israel, brought out of Egypt, wandering in the desert for 40 years, homeless nomads, neither here nor there. Yet God is faithful and he keeps his promises. He's brought them across the Jordan River into the promised land. They have rest on every side from all their enemies. Now, I grew up in Sydney. I lived there till I was 9 years old, but after spending my high school years just south of Tamworth, I love the wide open spaces. So I like getting back to Sydney and visiting family, but I find the city with traffic and houses and closed-in spaces just a bit restrictive. So as we drive back out on the highway through the mountains, I have this experience as I come down Victoria Pass. The country just opens up before you, and I breathe a sigh of relief. And on a beautiful, clear day, I can imagine that perhaps this is how Israel felt, crossing the Jordan River into the promised land. And one of the wonderful things about living out here is that I can enjoy getting out into nature. But I tell you, if I lived in Gaza or Israel now, or in Ukraine, I can imagine that venturing out into creation to enjoy God's world would feel quite different. You see, I'm free to enjoy God's creation because I know that essentially I'm safe. There are no enemies around me. And so in Joshua 21, verse 44, when God gives Israel rest on every side from their enemies, this points back to the Garden of Eden, when God's people are in God's place, under God's rule and blessing, experiencing a state of rest and peace with creation and with God and with each other. That state of rest is the beginning of all things, and it is the aim, it is the end of all creation. It is the rest that we can only have in God's kingdom, God's people under God's rule and blessing, in God's place. But as we fly over the landscape looking down at the story of the Bible from above, we work our way through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua. Things are looking pretty good. Life in the promised land, it's looking promising. We finally have God's people, Israel, under God's rule, given the 10 Commandments. And finally, they're in God's place, in the promised land. But it starts to come undone in a fairly dramatic way in the book of Judges. We have this cycle of disobedience, followed by obedience, followed by more disobedience. God raises up a judge, a leader for Israel. Israel obeys and blessing follows. And then the leader dies. And Israel falls into disobedience. And so the cycle continues. Will God raise up a leader who Israel will follow in obedience forever? Well, last week we saw that where Adam and Eve failed, Jesus was the perfect Adam, the perfect man, the one who lived perfectly as a man, created in God's image, living that out, and in fact bearing God's exact image, his exact representation. And today we've seen not only the need for a new kind of humanity, a humanity perfected by Jesus, but also the need for a new kind of leader, a new kind of king. The problem with the partial kingdom that we see turns out to not only be the people of the kingdom, but the flawed and failed kings, the leadership. Even David, who was a man after God's own heart. But as we look a little ahead to the next message in this series, the prophecies about God's coming king and his kingdom, God says to David in 2 Samuel 7 that he will raise up offspring to succeed him. And this is not only looking ahead to Solomon, but this is a foreshadowing of the coming of King Jesus, the true king, the true offspring of David, who will build a house for God and whose throne will be established forever. So next week we'll have a short break in this series because I'll be leading our brothers and sisters at Peak Hill. But the week after that we'll pick up again as we look forward to the kingdom prophesied by the Old Testament prophets, the coming king who will finally bring peace on earth.